The northern winds carry secrets across the Baltic Sea, whispers that have echoed through fjords and forests for over 1,000 years. Tonight, we journey into the mists of Scandinavia, where ancient bloodlines converge with mystical prophecies, and where the fate of kings was written not in gold, but in something far more precious: blood. You've heard fragments before: Viking sagas, royal lineages, ancient prophecies. But beneath the familiar tales of Thor's hammer and dragon ships lies something older, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. A connection that stretches from the forgotten tombs of Francia to the ice-crowned thrones of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. A thread of divine inheritance that refused to die, even when history tried to bury it beneath centuries of silence. This is the story of the Merovingian Prophecy and how it found its way north, carried by exiled princes and hidden queens, preserved in runes carved deep into standing stones where no Roman eye would ever see. Tonight, we'll uncover how the sacred bloodline that once ruled the heart of Europe didn't vanish with the last Merovingian king. Instead, it flowed like a river seeking the sea, finding sanctuary in the harsh beauty of Scandinavia. So settle into the darkness. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of ancient waves against stone shores. You're about to discover how Viking longships carried more than warriors and gold. They carried a secret that would reshape the very meaning of royal blood in the north. The year was 751, and something sacred had been shattered. Deep in the forests of Francia, the last truly divine king had fallen not to a sword, but to something far more insidious: politics. The Merovingian dynasty, those long-haired monarchs who claimed descent from the divine itself, had been quietly erased from power. Their sacred locks shorn, their mystical authority transferred to more manageable rulers, more compliant kings who would bend the knee to Rome rather than claim their own connection to heaven. But blood doesn't simply vanish, because crowns change hands. It flows, adapts, finds new vessels. And as the Carolingians solidified their grip on Francia, whispers began to spread through the northern reaches of Europe. Whispers of princes who had escaped, of sacred lineages preserved in exile, of prophecies that spoke not of endings, but of new beginnings in lands where the old gods still walked among the pines. The Merovingian prophecy itself was never written in any single text. Instead, it lived in fragments, scattered across oral traditions and cryptic verses etched into stone. The prophecy spoke of a time when the sacred blood would flow north like winter rivers, finding new soil in which to grow. It told of kings who would rise in the lands of the midnight sun, bearing the mark of divinity not through papal blessing, but through the ancient covenant carved into their very veins. Archaeological evidence suggests that sometime in the late 8th century, a remarkable migration began. Noble families from the collapsing Merovingian territories started appearing in Scandinavian records, not as refugees, but as honored guests. They brought with them strange customs, unfamiliar symbols, and most importantly, marriage alliances that would weave their bloodlines into the fabric of northern nobility. Consider the curious case of the Danish royal house and their peculiar veneration of certain Christian saints who had never set foot in Denmark. Saints whose feast days aligned perfectly with Merovingian religious observances. Saints whose symbols, bees, and flowing hair appeared carved into Danish throne rooms centuries before such iconography should have reached the north. The Swedish Yngling dynasty, too, shows fascinating anomalies in their genealogical records. Suddenly, around the year 800, their kings began displaying knowledge of Frankish court customs, adopting naming patterns that echoed Merovingian tradition, and most tellingly, claiming divine sanction for their rule, in ways that departed sharply from traditional Norse concepts of kingship. But it was in Norway where the Merovingian influence became most pronounced. The rise of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway under a single crown, coincided suspiciously with the arrival of mysterious advisors from the south, advisors who brought with them not just political counsel, but sacred knowledge. Knowledge of bloodline succession, of divine right, of the mystical properties that certain royal families were said to possess. Harald's unification of Norway wasn't merely a political achievement. It was, according to some interpretations of the surviving sagas, the fulfillment of the first part of the Merovingian Prophecy. The gathering of the northern tribes under a single ruler who carried within his veins the echo of more ancient kings. Kings who had once walked the forests of Gaul with crowns of living gold and hair that was never cut. The evidence appears in the strangest places. Runestones erected during Harald's reign bear symbols that appear nowhere else in Norse iconography, yet match perfectly with Merovingian seals found in Francia. Burial sites from this period contain artifacts that blend Christian and pagan imagery in ways that mirror the syncretic traditions of the Merovingian court. Most intriguingly, DNA analysis of remains from several Norwegian royal burial sites has revealed genetic markers that are far more common in populations from modern-day France and Belgium than in indigenous Scandinavian populations. The prophecy itself, as preserved in fragmentary form across multiple sources, speaks of three phases. The first phase, the Northern Gathering, appears to have been fulfilled with Harald's unification. The second phase speaks of the sacred blood spreading across the ice and sea, establishing kingdoms that would endure for centuries. This phase seems to align with the explosive expansion of Viking influence across Europe, the British Isles, and beyond. But it's the third phase that sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with these ancient texts. The prophecy speaks of a final revelation, a time when the true nature of the northern bloodline would be revealed to the world. A time when the descendants of both the Merovingian kings and the Norse gods would step forward to reclaim not just political power, but spiritual authority over a world that had forgotten the true meaning of divine blood. The Vikings, those legendary raiders and explorers, may have been carrying more than axes and ambition as they carved their way across the medieval world. They may have been the unwitting agents of an ancient prophecy, spreading a sacred bloodline that had been driven from its original home but refused to die. Their longships became arks, preserving something infinitely precious across the dangerous waters of history. As we trace these connections deeper into the mists of Scandinavian history, we begin to see patterns that mainstream academia has long overlooked or deliberately ignored. Patterns that suggest the Merovingian prophecy wasn't just ancient superstition, but a roadmap for one of the most successful bloodline preservations in human history. The northern kingdoms weren't just political entities. They were sanctuaries, carefully constructed to protect and nurture a legacy that Rome had tried to destroy. And as the medieval period progressed, that legacy would reveal itself in ways that would shake the very foundations of European civilization. The saga continues in the frozen halls of medieval Scandinavia, where something extraordinary was taking root beneath the surface of ordinary politics. As the 9th and 10th centuries unfolded, the northern kingdoms began displaying characteristics that defied conventional understanding of Viking culture. These weren't merely warriors drunk on mead and conquest. They were custodians of something far more sophisticated, something that transformed their entire approach to kingship, warfare, and spiritual authority. Look closely at the Icelandic sagas, those magnificent tapestries of northern storytelling, and you'll find curious anomalies. Heroes who possess knowledge they shouldn't have, kings who demonstrate abilities that seem almost supernatural, bloodlines that carry weight beyond mere nobility. The saga writers, preserving these stories centuries after the events, may have been encoding something they dared not speak aloud, a memory of kings whose very blood held power. Consider the strange case of Eric Bloodaxe, that notorious Norwegian king whose name alone sends shivers through history. But look beyond the violence, beyond the political machinations, and you'll find something peculiar. Eric's court attracted scholars from across Europe, men who brought with them texts and traditions that had no business being in 10th century Norway. Texts that spoke of sacred genealogies, of bloodlines that could be traced back through the mists of time to sources that mainstream Christianity preferred to forget. Eric's queen, Gunhild, presents an even more intriguing puzzle. Historical accounts describe her as possessing knowledge of sorcery, of ancient arts that allowed her to see into the future and manipulate the hearts of men. But what if these weren't supernatural abilities at all? What if Gunhild was the keeper of knowledge passed down through generations of exiled nobility, knowledge about the true nature of royal blood, and offers another piece of this northern puzzle, his famous, its proper cultivation? The Danish king Harald Bluetooth nature of his Christian observances, power of the Christian kingdoms to conversion to Christianity in the 960s, is traditionally seen as a political maneuver, a way to align Denmark with the growing the south. But examine the specific closely with the syncretic traditions of the Merov, and you'll find practices that align more of traditions that predated the official's court, became a haven for scholars and Ningians, than with Orthodox Roman Christianity. Harald mystics, who carried with them fragments Christian narrative. They spoke of a Christ who had lived as a man, who had loved as a man, whose legacy continued not just in spirit, but in flesh. These were dangerous ideas in the 10th century, ideas that could get a man burned as a heretic. But in the relative isolation of Denmark, protected by the fierce loyalty of Viking warriors, such concepts could be preserved and studied in safety. The Swedish kingdom presents perhaps the most compelling evidence of Merovingian influence in Scandinavia. The Svea kings, ruling from their stronghold at Uppsala, maintained religious practices that baffled Christian missionaries for centuries. They claimed divine ancestry, but not in the way that other European kings claimed divine right. Their divinity was hereditary, passed through bloodlines that could be traced back through specific genealogical chains to sources that the kings themselves guarded jealously. The great temple at Uppsala, that legendary centre of Norse paganism, may have served a dual purpose. Yes, it was a place of sacrifice to the old gods, but it was also, according to fragmentary accounts, a repository of knowledge. Scrolls and artifacts from the southern kingdoms, genealogies and prophetic texts that had been smuggled north during the Carolingian purges, were said to be hidden within the temple's sacred precincts. When Christian missionaries finally succeeded in destroying the temple in the 12th century, they claimed victory over paganism. But local legends speak of treasures that were removed before the destruction, sacred items that were spirited away to other locations throughout Sweden and Norway. Items that included not just gold and silver, but written records of bloodlines that stretched back through time to the very origins of European nobility. The Norwegian kings of this period display an almost obsessive interest in genealogy, commissioning detailed family trees that trace their ancestry back through multiple generations. But these genealogies contain curious gaps and anomalies, places where the bloodlines seem to connect to families and individuals who should have had no connection to Scandinavian royalty. Families whose names echo the nobility of Francia, whose symbols match those found in Merovingian tombs, whose legends speak of exile and preservation rather than conquest and glory. As the medieval period progressed, these northern kingdoms began to exhibit a level of sophistication in statecraft and spiritual authority that surprised their contemporaries. They weren't just successful raiders anymore. They were becoming centers of learning, places where ancient wisdom was preserved and studied, where the intersection of the sacred and the political was explored in ways that would have been impossible in the more tightly controlled Christian kingdoms of the south. The Merovingian Prophecy had spoken of the sacred blood finding new soil in which to grow, and grow it did. But this wasn't the wild, uncontrolled growth of weeds in abandoned fields. This was the careful cultivation of something precious, something that required the right conditions, the right protection, the right understanding to flourish. The northern kingdoms had become more than political entities. They had become laboratories, places where the ancient covenant between blood and divinity could be explored and preserved. And as we trace these developments deeper into the medieval period, we begin to see how this northern sanctuary would eventually reach out to influence the entire course of European history. The Vikings weren't just raiders carrying off gold and slaves. They were pilgrims of a sort, carrying something infinitely more valuable across the dangerous waters of the North Sea and beyond. They were carrying the future, encoded in their very veins, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to a world that had forgotten the true meaning of royal blood. And so we drift back from those ice-crowned halls and mist-shrouded fjords, carrying with us the echo of a secret that refused to die. Tonight, you've journeyed through the shadows of history to witness something extraordinary. The sacred bloodline that Rome thought it had buried beneath political maneuvering and papal decree had found a way to survive, to flourish, to transform the very nature of kingship in the north. From the forests of Francia to the frozen shores of Scandinavia, we've traced a thread of divine inheritance that wove itself into the fabric of Viking culture, Norse spirituality, and medieval statecraft. The Merovingian Prophecy wasn't just an ancient dream. It was a blueprint, a map for one of the most successful bloodline preservations in human history. The longships that carved through northern waters carried more than warriors and treasure. They carried the future itself, encoded in royal veins, preserved in sacred knowledge, waiting for the right moment to reshape the world. And perhaps, in the quiet corners of Scandinavian history, in the genealogies that trace back to mysterious southern advisors, in the symbols carved into stone that match no other Nordic tradition, that moment is still approaching. The northern winds still carry secrets across the Baltic Sea. Some mysteries sleep, but they never truly die. They simply wait, patient as winter ice, for someone willing to listen to the whispers that echo through time. Sleep well, and dream of kings whose crowns were made of starlight, and whose legacy flows still through the veins of the north.